be seated. Court is in session. Are we ready for bring the jury in and your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Will you call Mark Osterman?
Well, we have to get the jury in first. That's okay. Let's go ahead and bring the jury in. Oh. Trish.
Jury is present, Your Honor.
Please be seated. And please call your next witness.
Today we call Mark Osterman.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony in these proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
You may. Yes, you may.
You state your name for the record, please, sir.
Mark Osterman,
And could you spell your last name?
Osterman.
And do you work for a federal agency, sir?
Yes, I do, the Federal Air Marshal Service,
Okay. How long have you been so employed?
since December of 2001.
Okay. Do you know a person by the name of George Zimmerman?
Very well.
Okay. And is he seated here in the courtroom today?
Yes, he is.
See, the person just stood up.
Yes, he is.
Your Honor, the record reflect the witness identified defendant, George Zimmerman.
The record will so reflect.
And how long have you known him approximately?
At least 5 years.
Okay. And you knew him back in February of 2012, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And would you consider him a very good friend?
Best friend I've ever had.
Okay. I want to draw your attention to February 26th, February 27th, the evening of February 26th, 27th. Did you get a call and you end up responding to the retreat at Twin Lakes?
I did.
And did you meet the defendant's wife, Shelley Zimmerman, there?
I did.
Okay. Later the following morning, early morning of the 27th, did you come into contact with the defendant, George Zimmerman?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you transport him somewhere with his wife, Shelley Zimmerman?
I did.
Okay. Did he make some statements to you regarding what he alleged happened regarding the shooting he was involved in?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did he specifically state that that Sunday night, the 26th, he was going shopping at Target?
Correct.
We object, Your Honor, leading.
Okay. If you could, tell us what the defendant told you, and let me set the setting if I could. You were with yourself, and I believe you were driving, is that correct?
I drove myself.
Okay.
You
I apologize.
before?
I believe I got to rephrase the question.
Right.
I apologize. Confused on my part. When Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, was telling you something about what happened, he was in the car with you, is that correct?
That is correct.
And were you driving?
I was.
And was his wife, Shelley Zimmerman, in the car with you and him?
She was.
Okay. And did he make some statements regarding what had happened regarding the shooting?
He did.
Okay. If you could tell us what the defendant said regarding what he alleged happened.
George said that on that Sunday night, he had left his home, as he did every Sunday night, to get lunches for the week. And as he was going to go to Super Target, which is really, really close to his home, he was going to, he just drives out of his neighborhood, and I think it was dark that night. And on his way there is when he observed someone in a black hoodie and someone who was looking like someone he had not seen before. And he knew most of the people in his neighborhood. So he had observed someone walking through the neighborhood with a hoodie on, looking either into windows or looking into around residences and such.
All right, let me interrupt you if I could. Did he describe the individual, he said?
He did.
How did he describe him?
Tall, about 6 foot, and about slender,
Okay.
slender build.
And he stated the person was doing something, you said?
He said walking through between two sets of townhomes, when you look to your left and right, you would look into windows. You wouldn't be in a position really to look into either the front door or such, but it was side windows.
Yes, sir. Did he further describe the individual by race or ethnicity?
Well, at that time, he knew that he was a black male.
Okay. I apologize. I interrupted you. You said, what else did the defendant tell you regarding what happened?
He said then when he realized that the person that was walking through the neighborhood was someone he didn't know, he didn't recognize, and someone who usually looks through a neighborhood while it's raining, it's suspicious, because a lot of times juveniles will walk through neighborhoods, or people who are suspicious will walk through neighborhoods while it's raining because you get less people walking around, walking their dogs, or just taking an evening walk. So someone who might want to be a little more suspicious, if they're acting suspicious, they'll do it when it's dark and when it's raining. And that might have been a trigger, he had said to me.
Right. Okay. What I want to do is focus as best you can in terms of what you recall him saying as opposed to...
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, he said he observed what is now, we realize is Trayvon, walking between the two buildings, and then he came down and he observed him, thought it was suspicious, and then he was going to call the non-emergency number for the Sanford Police Department.
Did he state that the individual that we're referring now as Trayvon Martin starts toward him and came under the light, and so he was using his phone?
Correct. George was using his, I'm sorry, did you mention George was using his phone or Trayvon?
What did he say?
I was never told by George that Trayvon was using his phone.
I'm sorry, that
George was.
George, I apologize.
Correct.
George Zimmerman was using his phone.
Correct. He dialed the non-emergency number, and he wanted to make sure that he called that line instead of the 911 line.
Did he say the person you know now as the victim, Trayvon Martin, approached this car?
Walked close at this point.
Okay, what does he say about that, if you could?
Walked down to the street, about where, because George had remained in his vehicle, and Trayvon had walked down, I guess down to the sidewalk area, walked a little further away, walked back a bit, and then George had, I believe, pulled into the front of their clubhouse and parked his vehicle there and waited for Sanford Police to arrive and
Okay, does
make
he say,
contact.
I apologize, I interrupted you, sir.
No, I'm sorry, just,
Okay, did he say that the person you now know is Trayvon Martin, when I say he, I'm talking about the defendant, George Zimmerman,
Right.
that he walked up to the passenger side window and stood there for a moment, then goes to the front of the car, comes around to my window, my driver's side, then towards the rear of my car, then walks away?
yeah, it was walked around the vehicle, very in close proximity, and I think they looked at each other, George had said.
Okay. Did he, the defendant, then say that at some point then he lost sight of the person you now know as Trayvon Martin?
Yes, briefly.
And do you recall then in terms of Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, saying that he was talking to the dispatch or to the non-emergency person, correct?
Yes.
And did he tell you that in terms of whether he was asked, are you following him, and he answered, yes, I'm following him, but he didn't see Trayvon Martin at that time, was looking for him?
Well, there's kind of two, as George described it to me, there were kind of two phases of the contact. The first one was when he first saw him, and then he pulled into the clubhouse parking lot, and then the second one was when he reestablished contact with Trayvon, who walked down another side street that wasn't the main street around the circle, and then he backed his car up, and then he tried to keep a visual contact with him, so he followed him with his car, and he didn't get out of his vehicle until he lost visual sight of him.
And then do you recall the defendant telling you that the officer or the dispatcher, I use officer just because they're with the police department, saying to the defendant that we don't need you to follow him, and he said okay?
Correct. That was at the point where he had already gotten out of his car first. And as he described to me, there were two reasons for getting out of the car. First, he didn't know the street, I guess he was on that center street. It's a smaller street. He didn't know the actual name of it, so he got out of his car to try to establish a visual contact to try to direct the police officer in to meet with Trayvon and dispel his suspicions and to find the exact address. Because as a police officer, you always want to know the exact address of where you're going.
All right, and then he told you, I'm sorry, the defendant, I apologize for using pronoun, that he started walking and then he put his phone somewhere?
He put his phone in his pocket after the dispatcher told him they didn't need him to follow him, so he was going to walk back to his vehicle.
Okay, and then he said something happened at that point?
He told me that as he was walking back to his car down the dog path, that Trayvon had confronted him, had walked towards him and confronted him, and they had a verbal.
Okay, and what do you recall a defendant telling you that Trayvon Martin told him, and what did he say in response?
He cursed. I'm not going to curse here today. He said, do you have a problem? And then he used a curse word.
All right, now, you wrote a book about this, right?
I did.
And you wrote a book and where you quoted what the defendant, George Zimmerman, told you, correct?
Correct.
And do you recall in that book writing, do you have a problem, that that's what he said, Trayvon Martin said?
Right. Correct.
Okay. And you didn't put in that book anything about a curse word at all?
I believe I did.
You did? Okay.
I believe I did. Do you have a problem? And then he used the initials MF.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, I may.
I'm going to show you your own book. And unless I got the wrong page, I'm on page 28, counsel. Just to refresh your memory.
Correct. Correct.
And don't read from it, you just, this is to refresh your memory.
All right. Yeah, he had told me that, do you have a problem? And then the curse word, it was taken out of the book because it was pretty graphic. And I
Oh, okay, so you on purpose you took it out?
I think the publisher had
Okay.
asked that not be put in.
Because you put on there, do you have a problem? And then Mr. Zimmerman, that you said, replied, no, I don't have a problem.
Correct. And it said
But you believe the words were actually what now, that the defendant said?
MF.
Okay, so these juries have heard, so just for the record to be
Okay,
clear.
I just
He
don't-
said, do you have a problem, motherfucker?
Correct.
Okay. And then the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, said in reply, no, I don't have a problem. And then Mr. Trayvon Martin replied?
You do now.
Okay. And the defendant claimed that Trayvon Martin, was coming at him at that time?
He was very close, probably within an arm's or 2 arms reach.
Okay.
And George lost contact visually.
And I apologize.
Okay. I'm sorry, go ahead. Go right ahead. No, he, as George was reaching down to get to his phone to reestablish contact with the dispatch, that's when physical contact happened.
So the defendant told you that he has these words with Trayvon Martin.
Correct.
And then he said that he went and reached for his phone in his pocket.
Correct. Looked down.
I'm sorry, he looked down.
He looked down to reach to get into his pocket.
And at that point is when Trayvon Martin hit him?
Struck him in the nose.
Okay. So the defendant claims he looked down, and that's when Trayvon Martin hit him.
Well, he looked down, got his phone, and he said as he looked back up, he lost visual contact for maybe a second to get his phone out of his pocket. He went like this, and as he looked up, the punch came squarely in his face.
So the defendant said he took the phone out or left it in his pocket?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't remember.
And then what did the defendant claim after he claims the victim hit him in the nose?
He stumbled backwards and found himself on his back,
Okay.
partially on the grass, partially on the sidewalk.
Did he say what the victim, Trayvon Martin, was doing at that point?
He moved forward and got on top of him.
Did he describe to you how he got on top of him?
His knees were up somewhere near his chest or up near his armpits,
Okay.
and he was beginning to punch him.
Okay, so the defendant is claiming that the victim straddled him, I guess?
Correct?
And his knees were up in his ribs and near his armpits, correct?
Correct.
and he began punching him.
That's what George said.
And I apologize, he began punching Trayvon Martin. Okay.
Trayvon began punching George Zimmerman.
I'm sorry, I got it backwards, sorry. The defendant's claiming he's on the ground,
And
Trayvon Martin is straddling him.
Was punching him,
And-
George. I'm sorry.
I apologize, Mr. Officer.
I'm sorry. He said that he was on his back, and Trayvon Martin straddled him and began punching him in the face.
But the way he described Trayvon Martin straddling the defendant, he claims that you said his knees were up to his rib cage or armpits, is that correct?
Somewhere around there, correct?
Yes, sir. Then he said, what?
Well, George began screaming for help at that point.
Did he say anything about the defendant grabbing his head and doing something with his head?
Absolutely. Once he started screaming, George said Trayvon grabbed his head and started bashing his head on the concrete, which his upper half of his body was on the dog path.
Right. In fact, I think you quoted Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, saying that he was 8 inches from the grass, correct?
About, as George was explaining it, this upper half of him, somewhere of this, where it was still on the concrete, where the rest of his body was on the grass.
And I think your quote is, I noticed that I'm about 8 inches away from the grass, correct?
Correct.
And then does Mr. Zimmerman, defendant, tell you that I tried to maneuver the body just enough to get my head onto the grass?
It was a squirm, he said. He said as he was squirming down towards the grass to keep his head from getting hit by the concrete, he says his jacket kind of remained still as you squirm. His jacket, since it wasn't buttoned, it stayed where it was, and his body moved towards the grass a little bit more.
What else did he say about anybody seeing this or coming out?
He said there were several people that came out, at least 2 that he saw that came out, and he directly screamed for help towards those people. So as he was screaming, it was more directed at someone.
And did he say one of the individuals that came out was a man, and he yelled directly at him, and the man just went right back in?
He stated he was going to call 911 and he wasn't going to get involved.
And did he say then there was other individuals that saw this too, correct?
Perhaps at least one other, for sure, that witnessed what was happening. It may have been the same person that had the flashlight that showed up later.
I think you can refer, if you need to refresh your memory, on page 28 where you quoted Mr. Zimmerman. Did you not, at the very bottom of page 28 of your book?
There were several people.
I think you said 2 other men saw us out there and did nothing.
Correct.
Correct?
I believe so. At least one other, maybe 2 others.
And then he claimed that Mr. Martin, or Trayvon Martin, was still on top of him and took his hands and put it over his nose, correct?
One hand was trying to cover his nose, one hand was trying to cover his mouth to keep him from screaming.
Right. And I think you quoted Mr. Zimmerman as saying that Trayvon Martin put his hand, takes one of his hands and puts it over my nose and pinches it closed while his other hand goes over my mouth.
It was described to me something like this, maybe
Okay.
a pinch, maybe not like that, but a pinch like that and a cover.
So, in other words, Trayvon Martin is using one hand over his nose and then one hand over his mouth, correct?
It's something to that effect.
And then, what does Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, say happened then?
He said that because his jacket rode up a bit, that perhaps with the inside of his leg, he felt or looked down and saw that he had a holster and a firearm.
Okay. Before the defendant said that, did he say that he desperately got both of my hands around the guy's one wrist and took his hand off my mouth long enough for me to shout again for help?
Right. That was the main thing he did with his hands, was to try to clear his mouth. Because with his mouth free, he could scream and he could breathe.
Okay. So the defendant is describing to you that Trayvon Martin's got one hand pinching or with his nose, and then he's got the other hand over his mouth, right?
Trying
he can't breathe or
Correct.
I got that right?
Correct.
And then the defendant is claiming that he took his hands and removed at least one hand Off of Trayvon Martin?
Off of his own mouth.
Okay. Defendant's claiming that he never hit Trayvon Martin at that time, or never just knocked him off of him, right?
That was not described to me.
Okay. And then the defendant told you he had a brief control of the wrist, but then he said, I knew when he felt the sidearm at my wrist with his leg, correct?
Say that one more time, sir?
For a brief moment, I had control of the wrist, but I knew when he felt the sidearm at my wrist with his leg.
That's when he let go of the other hand let go, and he said that he went for the gun.
Okay. Did he
Grabbed
say
for it.
Trayvon Martin went for the gun, correct?
Grabbed for the gun.
Okay. And I think you quoted him as saying he took his hand that was covering my nose and went for the gun, saying something at that point, correct?
He did.
He said, what words did he utter?
He says, you're going to die, and he used the MF term again. I'm sorry, I don't like to curse in front of ladies.
And for the record, he used the word, you're going to die now, motherfucker, correct?
That is correct.
And then I think you got the defendant quoted as saying, somehow I broke his grip on the gun when the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer, correct?
Could have been the leather, could have been the gun.
Well, I think you quoted him on page 29, and refresh your memory if you need to,
Correct.
as, under quotations, somehow I broke his grip on the gun when the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer, so...
That's where the leather strap is, though. That's what holds the gun in.
So the defendant is claiming that the victim actually grabbed the gun,
That was my understanding, that he grabbed the gun. That would have been the only place that was available to grab.
And then he said the defendant managed to get the gun in his hand and raised it towards Trayvon Martin's chest and pulled the trigger, correct?
Unfortunately, yes.
And then he claims after he shot Trayvon Martin that Trayvon Martin sat up and he heard him say, you got it, okay, you got it, something like that.
Correct.
And then the Trayvon Martin pivoted 90 degrees and fell face forward onto the grass, and he scooted from under him.
Correct.
And the defendant claims he didn't know he shot him.
He didn't know he struck him, correct.
I'm sorry, struck him.
Correct.
In fact, the defendant went on to tell you that he thought Trayvon Martin, I know he wasn't calling him Trayvon Martin.
I understand.
I think he referred to him as the guy or whatever, might try to get up again. So after putting his gun back in the holster, he jumped on top of Trayvon Martin and pinned him down, correct?
Correct.
And then he said a man approached him out of the darkness and
First
thought it
man
the
was
police,
not.
correct?
First man was not a police officer. The second was.
And you recall also that when he's describing in terms of the first contact he had out there when he was calling the non-emergency number, that he said, we need you to get to a place where you can see him in terms of observing Trayvon Martin?
Right. Well, that's... He had said that he had to get somewhere where he could observe Trayvon or observe any subject that's in his neighborhood to be able to direct police officers to them. So whether he actually, whether the dispatch actually said, we need you to move to where you can see them, I'm not sure if that actually was what occurred. But he had said that his instructions from Sanford Police, whenever they came to their complex, was always to get to where you can observe and try not to make contact.
And he told you that the officer was almost there at the scene in about 45 seconds or something, or the dispatcher's telling him that, correct?
Well, I guess time is relative at that point, but yes, very, very shortly after.
I'm saying, when he's talking, he's saying the dispatcher's telling him the officer's almost there. He's
Correct.
within 45 seconds.
Correct.
And he told you that, and I'm going back now in terms of when the dispatcher, he tells you that he told the dispatcher just have the officer meet me at the clubhouse, correct?
That is correct.
And that he put his phone in his pocket to turn around to head back to the car when the guy is there about 15 feet away from walking towards him, right?
Correct.
So he's saying that Trayvon Martin, I apologize, I'm using the name Trayvon Martin, but you know who I'm talking about.
Correct.
He's describing this person's 15 feet away and walking towards him, correct?
Correct.
And he says, do you have a problem? And then what occurs? You said he said some other words, MF, but you didn't put it in the book, correct?
Correct.
He also told you that when he managed to get his hand off of Trayvon Martin's hands off his mouth, that he had control of the wrist, correct?
To some degree, to prevent him from putting it back over his mouth, yes.
Right. And he told you that the defendant managed to break the grip on the gun where the guy grabbed it between the rear side and the hammer, correct?
Whether it was the gun or the leather casing, or just reaching down there and grabbing something.
Right, but I think,
Broke the grip of the gun or the holster.
now, you didn't refer to the holster when you wrote it down in the book, correct? You just put gun.
Correct.
Right.
Because the holsters, that's exactly the place where the holster holds the firearm in place. So whether it was actual firearm or holster, I didn't see a difference. If someone grabs a hold of the holster or grabs a hold of the gun, their intent is probably the same.
And the defendant's telling you then that he shot at Trayvon Martin, but he didn't know whether he struck him or not. He thought
Correct.
the shot went wide, correct?
He did say that.
I may have a moment, Your Honor. I don't have any further questions.